Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for your time today. I'm presenting from my home in Brisbane, Australia, but before I begin my presentation today, I'd like to first acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting today, albeit virtually, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. My presentation today will reflect on Indigenous values and aspirations for collaboration in managing Moreton Bay and catchments as social ecological systems. In particular, the presentation is based on a research project carried out in southeast Queensland as part of an ARC linkage project for monitoring and evaluating Moreton Bay and its catchments as a social ecological system. The research took place between January 2013 and March 2015. So Southeast Queensland is one of the fastest growing regions in Australia, making Moreton Bay and its catchments a multifunctional region with diverse stakeholders, each with competing water interests. So issues such as population growth, climate change, and environmental decline have prompted increased calls for better recognition and involvement of Aboriginal people in water management. Although most Australian jurisdictions, including Queensland, have struggled to appropriately recognise Indigenous interests in their institutional frameworks. Instead, Aboriginal interests in water are often defined by ideas of cultural value, which are tied to notions of spirituality or custom. And this narrow perception of Indigenous values towards water provides little guidance for water planners and decision makers. So as a result, there are limited opportunities for formal participation of Indigenous peoples in water management. This research aims to expand understandings of Aboriginal values towards water as more than just cultural, for the purposes of improved Aboriginal involvement in water management. So the key objectives of this research were to find out how traditional custodians value SEQ waterways and provide an improved understanding of Indigenous values in order to assist managers to adequately account for Aboriginal interests in future water management and policy. And it was hoped that a long-term outcome of this research would help to expand the potential for meaningful Aboriginal involvement and opportunities in water management. The research was carried out in southeast Queensland, focusing on Moreton Bay Marine Park and the rivers and creeks that flow into the bay. The study area extended from Ipswich in the west to Caloundra in the north, and it included Moreton Bay Islands and the Gold Coast in the south. 4 workshops were conducted throughout the project in collaboration with SEQ traditional custodians who helped to co-design the research process. So custodians were both partners and participants in this study. 12 semi-structured interviews and 2 focus groups were carried out with a total of 20 traditional custodians between May and October of 2014. The interviews were recorded, transcribed, and then analysed using Stephen Kellett's framework of 10 relational values to find what values emerged from people's relationships with SEQ waterways. So moving on to the findings of the research, and we'll start with humanistic values. So most participants talked about their love of certain water places, which came from a range of experiences that people have with waterways, such as work, recreation, and social or personal activities. But custodians also often recalled childhood memories and time spent with family and friends. These experiences are significant to creating emotional ties with waterways. Ancestral links to waterways emerged as an important and unique connection for Aboriginal custodians as well, where relationships with freshwater places or sea country were almost always grounded in ancestral connections that date back thousands of years, and so are deeply embedded in many people's cultural identity. When analysing moralistic values, we found that many participants felt a moral obligation to maintain a reciprocal relationship with the environment and preserve a natural balance. This was considered a cultural responsibility and described as a custodial ethic. Part of people's ideals for caring for country also involved education, which is a highly valued tool for engaging and teaching younger generations to look after waterways. Naturalistic values emerged predominantly through people's activities around waterways, like swimming, fishing, or watching wildlife. This frequent interaction with waterways creates a real sense of belonging for people. Utilitarian values were evident in people's descriptions of practical use of fresh and saltwater resources for essentials. This included washing, cooking, and food resources, but also economic interests such as oyster leases or recreational activities, including camping and fishing. In a fundamental sense, water resources were recognised as essential to all forms of life, and there was great value placed on sustaining natural resources in order to retain a quality of life. Perhaps more unique to Aboriginal culture, participants distinguished between natural resources for human use and cultural resources as natural elements with cultural significance. So access and use of cultural resources was considered essential to preserve cultural knowledge and learning. Traditional custodians placed high value on ecosystem health and function. This was reflected in people's formal and informal activities and their participation in environmental management groups to monitor ecosystem health. Describing Southeast Queensland as one big ecosystem, many custodians were concerned with the flow and effects from impacts to waterways and to the health of other natural resources. The condition of natural elements and wildlife was often referred to as an indicator of ecosystem health. Interestingly, ecosystem health and function was intertwined with aesthetic appeal. Waterways were often perceived and described as beautiful or appealing if environmental indicators such as an abundance of wildlife or the depth of a river showed that it was a healthy system. In comparison, custodians also described the lack of appeal of some places, where the brown colour of the water indicated a poor ecosystem and created a negative experience. Similar to Kellett's interpretation, some participants recalled feelings of awe when visiting places that provoked a state of calm and connection. We found that a unique dimension of spiritual values exists for Indigenous Southeast Queenslanders that relates to Aboriginal cosmology, which is embedded in all aspects of the natural environment. For example, one participant explained, all of the waterways are significant because our dreamtime and creation stories are all encompassed around the waterways, the mountains, and the coastal areas. Though not as prevalent as other values, symbolic values were evident in Aboriginal place names that symbolise historical events, people, stories, or environmental features. We found that the stories and meanings associated with place names provided another way for people to connect to their country as an expression of their own historical, cultural, and spiritual belonging. Some negativistic values were expressed according to physical properties associated with water bodies. So, for example, people express caution around waterways due to the prevalence of bull sharks in rivers or concerns about pollution to various water resources. So these concerns caused people to avoid activities like swimming, drinking, or eating natural resources as they once did. Other negativistic values emerged from people's spiritual beliefs, where caution and avoidance of certain water places was a sign of respect to water spirits and ancestors. As for dominionistic values, none were found in this research, but that's not to say that they don't exist among traditional custodians. In fact, it would be naive to think that in an urban population such as Southeast Queensland, Aboriginal people don't undertake in any activities that may be considered dominionistic. Although outside of Kellett's typology of values, cultural heritage was a predominant theme that emerged throughout interviews and does deserve some consideration when identifying Aboriginal values towards ecology. Custodians consistently referred to the importance of cultural sites, bora rings, middens, skeletal remains, fish traps, scarred trees, and more generally artefacts. While we argue that Indigenous values towards water encapsulate more than cultural heritage, it is clearly evident that material cultural heritage continues to be significant to Aboriginal identity as it provides a tangible connection to country. The findings of this research show that Indigenous values towards water encompass more than limited ideas of spirituality, custom, and cultural heritage. Aboriginal values towards water reflect similar notions to Kellett's universal approach, but also elements of cultural difference, shaping the ways in which many of these values are expressed. Southeast Queensland traditional custodians desire better recognition and involvement in water management domains. Achieving this outcome requires meaningful engagement or partnership, improved understanding of Indigenous interests, and strong relationships with decision makers and governing organisations. An expanded understanding of diverse Aboriginal values and interests in water from this research can inform future government and community-driven initiatives for future waterways management, therefore creating more opportunities for Indigenous partnership and involvement in caring for country. So it is promising to see that since conducting this research, there has been encouraging progress towards better recognising Indigenous voices and water interests in some formal and informal Queensland water management initiatives. I've listed just a few on the screen here. As water management planning reviews for the Moreton Bay region continue in the coming years, there is great opportunity here for managers to improve dialogue with Southeast Queensland Aboriginal custodians and promote Indigenous voice and aspirations in future water policy and planning. So that's the end of the presentation. I hope you've enjoyed it, and thank you for listening.